Hello and welcome. You're listening to Secret History NZ, the only podcast on the web exploring the history of New Zealand along with alternative views you were never taught in social studies, which your friends are only brave enough to talk about after finishing their 15th double brown on Waitangi Day. This is episode 1, The Country That Time Forgot, and what a better place to start than the beginning. But where exactly is the beginning in a book which is missing its first chapters? And why are these chapters missing at all? From catastrophic supervolcanoes and ancient sea monsters to government conspiracy and magical curses. We will cover it all. Secret History starts now. Tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings and salutations. I'm your host, Sean Green, and you're listening to Secret History NZ. So, I think the hardest part of researching for a podcast like this is deciding a logical starting point. And for a country with such a diverse and rich history as New Zealand, that's no easy task. Should we start with the Treaty of Waitangi, signed in February of 1840? Well, that's most definitely not the beginning, but don't worry, we'll get back here eventually. What about James Cook's famous circumnavigation of New Zealand, 71 years earlier in October 1769? No, I didn't think that was the right place to start either. Modern history books might start 127 years earlier than this, 1642. The year Abel Tasman, working for the Dutch East India Company, supposedly became the first European to sight the land of New Zealand. But the modern history books would be wrong. What about the ancestors of the Maori, landing here in Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud, after a long journey across the Pacific in their great waka, roughly 700 years ago in 1250 Common Era? I think we're on the right track. But 700 years is only a blink of an eye in the time frames we're going to have to deal with to understand the true history of this beautiful country. This episode will provide you with a crash course in the last 84 million years of New Zealand to get you up to date for the more in-depth exploration we'll conduct in future episodes. Some people, especially Australians, like to throw around the idea or joke that New Zealand should become a state of Australia. Well, what you might not know is that NZ was once a part of the New South Wales colony, and that even to this day in the Constitution of Australia there is an article that says New Zealand can choose to become a state of theirs whenever we like. Now, I'm opposed to this idea. In fact, I feel like we should be forging an even stronger identity as Kiwis and New Zealanders, even though I do accept that some things like pavlova, crowded house and Weet-Bix have a shared history in both countries. 85 million years ago, this sentiment couldn't have been truer. New Zealand and Australia were one landmass, remains left over from the supercontinent Gondwana land. The good old process of continental drift ripped us from the clutches of Australia and sent us moving. This landmass, today's New Zealand, drifted north. By 55 million years ago, it was located between latitude 60 and 50 degrees south, and 2,000 kilometres from eastern Australia, a distance it has more or less maintained ever since. Many people think of NZ as an island country, but if you lowered the sea level, or even have a look the next time you watch a weather report with satellite imaging, you would see that we're actually part of a larger continent known as Zealandia. This continent is about 4 million square kilometres, although roughly 93% of it lays underwater. Land in Zealandia above water, in today's age, with human population, include mainland New Zealand and its nearby islands, and its most outlying islands, including the Antipode, Auckland, Bounty and Campbell Islands, as well as the Chatham Islands. These make up about 92% of all Zealandia above water. New Caledonia and the islands surrounding it comprise some 18,000 square kilometres, or about 7% of the above sea mass of Zealandia, and Australia controls only 0.03, with Lord Howe Island Group, Norfolk Island, as well as Elizabeth and Middleton Reefs. Over most of geologic history, long-term average sea level has been significantly higher than today, and some scientists believe Zealandia may have even been completely submerged 23 million years ago. This is a theory that I bring up as an interesting point, but I feel as though there is more evidence to show that there were pocket islands of high ground that served as a Noah's Ark during the submersion events of the last 23 million years. And whilst most of the living things in New Zealand show evidence of having arrived in the last 20 million years, a significant portion of our fauna and flora have a very ancient lineage and have been residents here ever since our part of Gondwana land broke off 60 to 80 million years ago. This list of ancient life forms includes, but is not limited to, the tuatara, geckos, kokako, many insects and snails, as well as the likes of the matai and the kauri, as well as the kura, our freshwater crayfish. Molecular dating tells us it comes from a very ancient lineage and diverged from its Australian relatives about 109 to 160 million years ago. Because their entire life cycle requires fresh water, kura are a clear evidence there has been continuous fresh water in Zealandia or New Zealand since our breakup with Gondwana. And as we all know, you can't have fresh water without land. Zealandia is mainly two ridges, which are made of continental rock, but are lower in elevation than normal continents, because their crust is thinner than usual, approximately 20 kilometres thick. Consequently, they do not float as high above the Earth's mantle. Where there are parts of Zealandia above water, it is usually in the form of islands where the two ridges meet. The ridges are formed as part of plate tectonics. To the northeast of New Zealand and underneath the North Island, the Pacific plate is moving towards and being subducted below the Australian plate. To the south of New Zealand and underneath Fiordland, the two plates are also moving towards each other, but here the Australian plate is being subducted under the Pacific plate, and because of this, New Zealand has lots of tectonic and volcanic activity. About 20,000 earthquakes, most of them minor, are recorded each year, with roughly 200 of these strong enough to be felt. New Zealand has an interesting history of volcanism. Whilst the South Island has many volcanoes and volcanic fields, none of these are active, or have been active for at least 8 million years. The North Island has been a bit more fruitful with blowing her load. Auckland, New Zealand's most populated city of 1.3 million, sits on a volcanic field of over 50 separate volcanoes. The North Island shows signs of numerous volcanoes which have erupted in the last 8 million years, as well as at least 15 major recorded events in written history. New Zealand, specifically Taupo, is home to the largest eruption anywhere of the last 70,000 years. This event is known as the Oroanui eruption. It happened 26,500 years ago, ejecting almost 1,200 cubic kilometres of material, covering some parts of the central North Island to a depth of 200 metres, as well as causing hundreds of square kilometres of surrounding land to collapse and form the caldera, which would eventually fill with water to become what we now know as Lake Taupo. This huge eruption wasn't the only time Taupo has gotten angry. It has erupted at least another 27 times since this event. Many scientists think that the event may have contributed to the last glacial maximum, which some people colloquially refer to as an ice age. Taupo's most recent explosion happened in 180 Common Era and is one of the most violent eruptions of the last 5,000 years. Both the Chinese and Romans have records from this time period that the resulting ash caused the skies over their countries to turn red. It was believed that the eruption column was 50 kilometers high, roughly twice that of the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens in the US state of Washington. It's impossible to talk about the formation of New Zealand without talking about Maui. Maui is a figure from Polynesian mythology and can be found in Tongan, Samoan, Tahitian and Hawaiian mythology, but of course we're dealing with the Māori versions of the events. Maui was a demigod who lived in Hawaii. He possessed magic powers that not all of his family knew about. He was the fifth son of his parents, and was born so premature, frail and underdeveloped that he could not possibly have survived. So his mother, Taranga, wrapped the fetus in a knot of her hair and threw it into the sea. He should have died, but the gods intervened, and Rangi, the Sky Father, nursed him through his infancy. Maui emerges from the sea as a grown child, and goes to his mother's house, finding there his 4 brothers. They are at first wary of this newcomer, and his mother doesn't recognize him, but after he performs feats, such as transforming himself into different kinds of birds, they acknowledge his power and admire him. He is eventually accepted into the family. One day, when he was very young, he hid in the bottom of his brother's boat in order to go out fishing with them. Once out at sea, Maui was discovered by his brothers, but they were not able to take him back to shore because Maui used his magic powers, making the shoreline seem much further away than it was in reality. So the brothers continued rowing, and once they were out into the ocean, Maui dropped his magic fishhook over the side of the waka, using blood from his own nose as bait. After a while, he felt a strong tug on the line. This seemed to be too strong a tug to be any ordinary fish, so Maui called to his brothers for assistance. After lots of straining and pulling, suddenly Te Ike a Maui, the fish of Maui, surfaced, known today as the North Island of New Zealand. Maui told his brothers that the gods might be angry about what had just happened. Such a huge fish must be tapu or sacred, and Maui hastily returned to his island home for a tahanga or priest to lift the tapu. Before leaving, he forbids his brothers from cutting up the fish. But of course, Maui's brothers begin to scale, divide up and eat the fish as soon as he was gone. This angered the gods and caused the fish to flap and lash about. For this reason, much of the North Island is mountainous. Had Maui's advice been followed, the whole island today would have been level. Where could these myths come from? Does Maui fishing up this new island correspond to the lowering of sea levels during a glacial event, or perhaps a tectonic event raising the land out of the ocean, or a combination of the two? I think in the future I will have to dedicate a whole episode to Maui because he has some great adventures, and I think it's interesting to compare the differences between the myths of the different Polynesian islands, along with trying to figure out what, if any, basis they have from the real world. The modern interpretation of history would have you believe that humans have only lived in New Zealand for about 750 years, since 1250 Common Era. But just think for a second. We live in a system where we know the government lies to us. So what is to say that they are not covering up our history to fit their agenda? As we all know, it is most often the victor of war is the one who writes the history. Well, all around the world we're starting to see evidence that civilization is far older than what we would have once dreamt of. Places such as Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. This is an ancient temple, which dates back to at least the end of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago, with a construction date thousands of years earlier than Stonehenge. This site consists of 20 round structures and elaborately carved pillars up to 18 feet tall and weighing 15 tons each, all from a time we had supposedly yet to discover pottery, writing, the wheel or metallurgy. We have Nga Madol in Micronesia and Gunung Padang in Indonesia to our west. Gunung Padang could be even older than Göbekli Tepe. Homo sapiens, or modern human beings, have been around for at least 200,000 years. I'm sure you've heard about Homo Floresiensis, or the Hobbit people. Well, these Hobbit fossils were also found in Indonesia. Various fossils show that they were there at least 84,000 years ago, and stayed until they were wiped out about 13,000 years ago. How did these little-statured people reach Indonesia? Well, there are two scientific hypotheses. The first is that they got there on rafts or boats, and the second is they were washed up by a flood or a tsunami. Just think about that for a second. Which one really makes more sense to you? We know that the Aboriginal people in Australia have been there for at least 50,000 years, and we know that the hobbits were in Indonesia 80,000 years ago. Are we really to believe that New Zealand has only been settled for 700 years? At the beginning of this podcast, I discussed the starting point for a book with missing chapters. Well, if the first 85 million years is the book of Genesis, perhaps this podcast is a fragment of a Dead Sea Scroll in comparison, but with enough fragments, we'll eventually be able to piece it all together. Well, that's about it for this episode of Secret History NZ. In our next episode, we'll be exploring the case for prehistoric Maori settlement in New Zealand, along with pre-colonial contacts. Before you go, if you like what you just listened to and would like to support me in creating future episodes, there are a few ways to do this. The first and easiest way is to subscribe and give me a thumbs up in YouTube. Feel free to leave your thoughts and constructive criticism in the comment section, or perhaps even if you have an idea you would like to see me explore in a future podcast. You can follow everything that is happening in the world of Secret History NZ by following us on Facebook at facebook.com/Secret History NZ. And, of course, if you like us, please make sure to share this podcast with like-minded or not-so-like-minded people. I'm your host, Sean Green, and you've been listening to Secret History NZ.